right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rising Seas Writing Stories, the Literature of Climate Change. Thank you to the Nantucket Book Festival for putting together this event, to our authors for coming all the way out to our island, and to all of you for attending today. My name is Molly Zegans. I work with the Youth Climate Committee here on Nantucket with Mass Audubon, and I have the honor of presenting these three authors today. Sarah Stoddola has written for the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Daily Beast, the BBC, CNN, Slice, and many others, often about books, travel, and other cultural topics. Her latest book, The Last Resort, A Chronicle of Paradise, Profit, and Peril at the Beach, is a cultural history of the beach resort that examines the growing importance in the world economy, as well as its future in the face of climate change. Tiya Miles is a professor of history and the Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. She is the author of 7 books, including 4 prize-winning histories about race and slavery in the American past. Miles publishes essays in various media outlets, and she has consulted with colleagues at historic sites and museums on representations of slavery, African American material culture, and the Black Native intersectional past. Miles' newest book is her Time-Bridge novel, The Cherokee Rose, a ghost story set in the plantation South and based on historical events. Before becoming an author, Jessie Greengrass studied philosophy in Cambridge. Her collection of short stories, An Account of the Decline of the Great Auk, According to One Who Saw It, won the Edgehill Prize and the Somerset Magnum Award. Her critically acclaimed debut novel, Sight, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Her latest book, The High House, follows an unconventional family as they survive a climate apocalypse in a house prepared by the mother, a climate scientist and activist. The 3 authors that we'll hear from today represent a wide range of visions around climate change, whether it be the cultural journalism of Sarah Stoddola, troubling our simple narratives around leisure, or the historical research of Tiya Miles, helping us update our stories about the past to better understand our place in the present, or the not-so-fictional future that Jessie Greengrass imagines, creating space for us to feel the emotional impact of our rising seas. The climate conversation is a large one, and we are lucky to have such an expansive group here today to share their perspectives. Finally, I'll leave you in the very capable hands of Mary Bergman, the moderator for this panel. Mary is a chair of the Nantucket Book Festival, director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, and a writer and historian who lives year-round on Nantucket. Let's welcome them.
Thank you to Molly. Molly works at Mass Audubon, and she works with our Youth Climate Committee at the Nantucket High School. And that was a beautiful introduction, and I think she so well explained why the talented, thoughtful writers who are sitting on the stage next to me are here before you today. Their diverse perspectives, different ways in which they're kind of coming at the climate crisis. And I know Molly mentioned a little bit about their work, but before we get into the conversation, I just wanted the authors here to share a little bit about the projects that they've worked on that are addressing climate change. And then we'll head on from there. Tiya?
Okay, you're looking at me, Mary. Well, I will say that I am so pleased for the chance to take part in this conversation. These are issues that I know I'm feeling, that people I'm close to are feeling, and rarely do we get a chance to actually air our concerns and air the ways in which we're approaching these issues. I was on a phone meeting with a longtime friend and colleague the other day, and she was talking about the Berkshires and everything that's going on in the Berkshires in terms of Black culture and Black history and Black arts. And she mentioned a very well-known chef who's been scouting the area, possibly to move there part-time. And she said, everybody is looking for a place to go. That really struck me, just thinking about how aware many people are and how we don't really talk about it. So I will say that my work on climate and environment has been slowly increasing over time. And with my most recent history, which is called All That She Carried, a history of a cotton sack that was passed down among a family of enslaved Black women in the South and Pennsylvania in the 19th century and early 20th century, seems like it would not be an environmental history, but it actually was. While I was doing that research, I was reading some of the work of David Glassberg, who is a public historian at University of Massachusetts, and he has written about how we kind of wonder and we grasp for ways that the humanities can be relevant in this moment of climate crisis or climate emergency. And he had the notion that historians can look for analogs in the past to help us to see, to make sense of, to think about and to consider climate crisis today. And so I really took that notion of historical analogs to heart in working on my book, All That She Carried. And I wrote in a way that I hope is visible to readers, such that the emergency that these Black enslaved women face, the ways in which they all of a sudden had a crisis before them and that they had to act, could be connected to our moment today, to the ecological emergency that we're facing.
Okay. So my background that kind of led to the book, The Last Resort, I was doing, among other things, a lot of travel writing over the course of a decade or so, and kind of became increasingly frustrated with the whole concept of travel writing, because travel writing has kind of been designated as its own genre, and the way that genre kind of manifests is as something aspirational, and there tends to be a kind of sentimental tone to the covering of travel, and to me, it wasn't really leaving any room for travel to be covered in a kind of hard journalism kind of way, and real deep investigations that a lot of other topics receive. And so the book kind of grew out of that. It's focused on beach tourism in particular, which, as we all know, is an industry that is on the very literal front lines of climate change. So that's the brief history of how it came to be. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, and it's so nice to be here. So I think that my book is different in that it's fiction, obviously, and very much the luxury of the fiction writer is that you don't have to provide answers. You can ask questions and leave them open. And I think that is an important part of fiction, and it's one of the ways it complements non-fiction, and you need both. So when I was starting to write The High House, I was beginning to think about it in late 2018, and I started writing it in 2019, and the world has changed so much in such a short time. But I realized that kind of I was frightened a lot of the time, that this, and it felt like I was looking around me and I thought, where are the books? Where is this conversation? I was talking to people privately, and they were, we were saying, God, I'm really scared. But then you'd have, you'd sort of 1 minute you'd be doing that, and then the next minute it would be like, oh, and so, I've been thinking that I might apply for a new job. And it's like there were these two threads that were kind of going through everything that we did. And you can't, it was like a kind of optical illusion. You could look at one of them or the other one, but you couldn't look at them both at the same time. And so I really wanted to explore how that feels, what it feels like to be living through a crisis, and also at what point do you call it a crisis? That seemed to be, again, an important question that's been coming up again and again over the last kind of decade, probably more. Who has to be suffering before you say that this is happening. And that's felt so relevant in the last 18 months, I think, because suddenly, in the UK, London was 40 degrees last summer. It was appalling. It was like, everything was dead. And suddenly people were like, oh, this is real. But then there have been voices saying that for so long. And so I really wanted to kind of look at that issue of who gets to decide when something is real, who gets to survive and what that means. So
I see you nodding your head, Tiya. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking about the fires in Canada, the smoke in the Northeast, and how some people in this region were all of a sudden saying, oh, this is bad.
Yeah, it's not just something that's changing the sunset, it's, anyway. I think we're here on an island. Obviously, sea level rise is something that people think about, and each of your works considers this changing relationship to the ocean in one way or another. The Last Resort looks at the cultural history of beach resorts, and The High House imagines a catastrophic future where living with water is inevitable. And Tiya has written about rising sea levels and how they threaten historic sites and displaced people. She's written about this very island on that topic. And humans have not always recreated and lived by the sea. And for a long time, the sea was something that people feared. And that's something that kind of Sarah touches on a bit in her work. And I was wondering, what is it about the seaside that is so captivating?
I can take that to start because it is so relevant. Yeah. My answer to that is that it's partially because we're conditioned to love it. It's not always been that way. Before, probably the 1700s or so, the ocean generally was considered a place to stay away from if you could, to be feared. It wasn't a place of recreation or leisure. And then that did start to change in the 1700s. The Romantic era had this kind of change in perspective where instead of just the ocean being a place of danger, it was a place where a person could go and kind of participate in something larger than themselves, get lost in something larger than themselves, a place for contemplation. And through that, it kind of became a more appealing place for people. And so that was part of what kind of transformed our approach to how we see the ocean. So I would say it's actually a relatively recent phenomenon that we see the ocean as this wonderful place, or the seaside as this wonderful place. The notion of paradise that gets applied to the beach and to the seaside is actually, I think, a 20th century phenomenon. If you think about the origins of the word paradise, it certainly had nothing to do with the ocean originally. So that is almost a kind of marketing gimmick that happened in the 20th century. While I think that the ocean is certainly awe-inspiring and there's beauty in it and all of that, I do think it is somewhat of a human construct that we see it as this really like a paradise. Yeah.
I think I heard you say in another interview, or the interviewer, that the Garden of Eden wasn't, paradise was the Garden of Eden. It was a garden. It wasn't a beach.
Exactly. And even before that, the origins of the term came from Persian nobles way back when their gardens of their palaces and their homes were a version of the word paradise. So.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how the three of your works also engage with this idea of paradise on one level or another. And Jessie, too, your High House is a holiday house or a summer house. So you sort of work with that dual meaning of the word retreat.
So I think that our relationship to the sea in the UK is quite different because we are essentially like a relatively small island. So the sea, people have always lived by the sea. We have always been fishing Obviously, our Navy and our kind of naval power has been historically incredibly important to us and absolutely devastating to pretty much everybody else. And so it kind of embedded in our kind of historical understanding of the sea has been an idea of precarity. So the sea gives and it takes, and that has been how we've lived with it for centuries. And then suddenly, in the last kind of, well, really since the Victorians, and then going through kind of the kind of first half of the 20th century, our relationship with it has really changed, and that sense that it's dangerous has been lost. But that's such a recent loss. It's like, if you know, my grandfather was, who's 97, he's still alive, was in the Merchant Navy. And he still has that sense of the sea as being this kind of extraordinary power. But in the 2 generations between us, that's fallen away. And I find that very interesting in terms of what we're facing, because it's like we think that we're so... We think that we're so protected. We think that we can overcome things. We think that we can have air conditioning and then it's not hot. We think that we can have central heating. You can turn a switch and give yourself comfort. And that's so recent. Yeah, sorry, I've got sidetracked from your actual question.
I mean,
but yeah, I mean, I just find it. So I guess that, you know, that idea of precarity and that is coming back to us, and like we're really surprised about it, and that is extraordinary to me.
all you have to do is, I've never been, but go and see the Grand Canyon to see the power of water, you know, right? And what. So I'm glad you took us there. Tiya, do you have any?
Yes, I'm glad you took us there too. My first reaction would be to want to broaden the question, Mary, and to think about water in an expansive sense.
Yeah.
And to think about the meaning of water to human life and human cultures, the association with the waters of the womb, with birth and waters, the fact that human settlements and civilizations can't exist without water and often situate themselves along waterways. This is a very powerful connection that we have with water. I think it's part of the draw that we have toward waterways, you know, including oceans. And I heartily agree with the comment that Jessie has just made about how these understandings of water used to come with huge caution flags, right? And I think we have come to trust our technologies, our modernization so much that we have thought for too long, just as you've said, that we have security and that we are sort of immune to being subsumed by these waters when we get too close.
Yeah, thank you. Another thread that I saw in all of your works was this idea of history. You know, Sarah's obviously engaging with the cultural history of resorts, the life cycle of a beach, or beach resort or tourist destination. Jessie has a character in the High House who's studying history at university and has to return to this sort of agrarian, like imposed agrarian life on them. Tiya, of course, is a historian whose work looks at Black and Indigenous histories. I'm kind of wondering, how does history, I'm a historian, as you heard, and we're on this whole island is a National Historic Landmark, so we're thinking a lot about history. We're in an old building where the windows don't open. Who decided we should have all these old buildings here? I wonder, how does history factor into your work of processing the current moment in your writing? In other words, what is the value in looking back when we have so much planning that we need to do? Whoever.
Okay. Well, I'll share first that, as Mary said, I've been studying African American and Native American histories and their interconnections for a very long time. And about 10 years ago, it hit me that my interest in these populations and their histories and their lives was meaningless if there was no earth and no environment, right? I mean, I was starting to come back to a very foundational baseline set of questions around, before you have communities, you have to have a place where they can live. Otherwise, it's the end of the book, it's the end of the story. And so I started turning my attention more toward questions of ecological context, questions of climate threat. And it's not just climate. You know, of course, we know there are all kinds of considerations that we need to face right now, including species loss, and so on. And the one thing I think about the way in which history can be instructive or helpful as we face up to our present moment and plan for the future is that historical thinking and writing and engagement is all about time. And the climate crisis is also all about time in a way that kind of confounds us because it seems to be moving so slowly that we don't quite believe it or we can't quite get a handle on it. We can tell ourselves it's something else. But it also moves so quickly in that all of a sudden, people can't breathe or see because of the smoke that's choking the Northeast. Or all of a sudden, the glaciers have melted dramatically at the top of the peaks at Glacier National Park. Because history is a time-oriented discipline and a time-oriented arena of thinking, it allows us to slow time down and to kind of stop time, which gives us the leeway, the flexibility to really consider these questions in moments of greater stillness, which I think we need. I think historical reading and discussion allows us to have some distance from the emergencies and therefore to be able to face them with a greater sense of stability or security.
What you were just saying reminds me, I think it's from F. Scott Fitzgerald talking about going broke or losing one's fortune, that it happened very slowly and then it happened all at once. And it feels like that's the impact of climate change also, and it feels like we are approaching the all at once moment. And I think we can all kind of sense that recently that we are approaching that moment. The thing that always strikes me in my research of beach resorts, throughout history is kind of the transitory nature of so many of them, how many of them aren't here anymore. And these places that we love, we kind of tend to think of, we kind of impose a sense of permanence on them. And that just isn't the case. And I think history can be really informative in that way that if you do want a place to continue to be here, there's things that have to be done. It's not a permanent thing that will just necessarily survive on its own and stay the way it is on its own. And there are so many countless examples of that throughout history that it always really resonates with me.
So I guess that I feel like there are two threads running through my kind of thinking and my work on this. And one is that it's very easy to romanticize the past and the way people that lived. We can say, well, like, why don't we just get rid of all of this stuff that we've got and then everything will be great and we can all... But it's incredibly hard work to exist without these things, like the labor that goes into just keeping warm in the winter. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that and to look at what a world would look like if we did strip ourselves of some of the resources that we currently have, but probably shouldn't have. I think that it's important to look back as well, because one of the things that does become clear if you look at the way that people lived at various points pre kind of the sort of industrialization that came in the late 19th century, it was very community-based. And the notion of care and taking care is going to be important again. I mean, it's always important, but I think that that's going to become more important. And the other thread is that I don't think that you can look at the climate crisis as a crisis in isolation. Like, it hasn't happened by itself. particularly, and again, like this is very much coming from a UK perspective, but I don't think that we can separate the climate crisis from our colonial history. The two things are kind of inextricably linked. And unless we can face up to our own history, I don't think that we're going to be able to understand why we treat the world as we do, why we are unable to understand that a crisis is happening when it's only happening in Bangladesh. You know, I think we have to look at that, because otherwise we're not going to fix this.
Absolutely. Brings me to another question. It's almost like we planned this, which is that in Sarah's book, In the Last Resort, we learn about the invention of leisure time. And that, these resorts were created, and historically, we did also, I don't know if you know, Sarah, but we did used to have like big resort hotels on the island, of course, which are gone. And there's only really one remaining. That's another conversation for why those are gone and who gets to be there in their place instead. But it was mostly white people who were going to these resorts, people who had the time, the money to go to these places. And Tiya has written a lot about how development of a place apart from a city, or rather, sorry, I read that wrong. I was hoping that Tiya could tell us a little bit about, she wrote this beautiful op-ed in the Times called Black Bodies, Green Spaces. It was kind of about who gets to exist in nature, and who gets to be an environmentalist. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that for those who haven't had a chance to think about it.
I would be very glad to, but if you allow me to,
Tiya, you can do whatever you want. You know that.
Okay. I would like to just pick up on some things that Sarah and Jessie said that I think are really compelling. One of those things is this issue of permanence. We love our illusion of permanence. Change is very difficult for us, I think, just as people. And yet permanence doesn't actually exist. I mean, even as we're sitting here in this church, we're changing, the environment is changing, the world is changing around us. And I think that we do need to do the difficult work of recognizing this is the reality. Things are always changing. And if we think back to the life practices of Indigenous peoples here and elsewhere, their relationships to their homelands tended to fold in that recognition of change, which doesn't mean that they didn't have settled societies and agriculture. Many of them did, but it also meant that they often picked up and moved to the resources, the natural resources, or picked up and moved away from the natural threats. And I think that we have in general terms, forgotten that that's necessary and forgotten how to do that. When it comes to the piece that Mary raised that I wrote that was titled, what's it titled? Black Bodies, Green Spaces. It was not my title.
Yeah.
It was titled by editors. That was a piece that I wrote because I wanted to think about the ideas that the general population associates with certain communities and certain peoples, the ways in which we see some people as being connected up with different kinds of nature, or being connected up with places that are seen as being unnatural. So I wrote in that piece about how there tends to be a surprise when people of color are, hiking the trails in the national parks. Because there's been this widely held sense that people of color don't do that. They're not aware of these kinds of spaces. They're not cognizant of or concerned with environmental issues, and that people of color, especially Black people, are instead connected with histories of exploitation that are land-based. So many people in the general population would first think about Black people picking cotton before they would think about Black people on a trail. And this has led to a lack of equal access to outdoor spaces, which are really critical for health and well-being. And I'll just, tack another point onto that, which is that people of color are often associated with cities, especially Black people. And of course, cities are natural places, but they get interpreted as being unnatural, as places that are, fully human-made, and humans are natural too, but as places that are fully human-made and where nature doesn't exist or doesn't thrive, which leads to a lack of attention to the importance of having open green spaces in cities.
Yeah. Well, before we go to audience questions, something that Tiya said, made me think. We have a saying where I work, which is that perpetuity is a relative term. It's we can protect these things for as long as we can until we can't. So there, I said it. Now, are there any questions from our audience here? All right. First, let's give a round of applause to these fabulous authors.
I had a question for Jessie. I used to live in the UK, in London, 3 different periods of my life. In the first one, 1979, for 6 months, I was working there, and the sky was always white, and I mean literally 6 months. I never saw blue. I never saw the sun. It was a white sky, which that's clouds, but it was always white because it was, quite remarkable. Then when I came back I went back to America, and I came back in 1984, and in London there was blue sky, sunshine, clouds, well, just like you would see here. And because I used to joke with my friends, and I'd say climate change has been good for London, because that's what it certainly looked like. I never noticed any other differences, from then on in my life. When I lived in London, it was what I consider normal, like New England. But I got to say something real quick. One time, 1989, I spoke to a man. I was in Russia, a man in Moscow. We were on the phone, and it was lightning. And he said it never does this. He was older than me. I can't even remember how old I was, but let's guess 30s. And he said, and he was older than me, like he could have been my parent. He said this never happens. And I said, I wonder if that's something different to do with the climate. But anyway, my question is, because I saw such a stark difference in 5 years in Britain, have you noticed changes anywhere in the United Kingdom that relate to climate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, increasingly over the last decade, undoubtedly over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. But I think your point is, I think the first point that you made about people saying, well, we know it's really good for us, is so important. Because absolutely, our climate is horrible. So, so initially people's response is absolutely, well, our summers have got warmer. It's suddenly we're not kind of living in coats from sort of September through to May. And so it for a long time, I feel like it has been very easy to dismiss it. I live in the northeast of the very, very far northeast of England now, right on the Scottish border. And it got to 30 degrees. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It's hot. I mean hot. Not super hot, but pretty hot. And that's unheard of. But it's also not, it's hotter than you necessarily want it to be, but it's not kind of devastatingly hot in kind of human experiential terms. It's sort of environmentally devastating probably in the long term. But it's not, again, it's kind of easy to dismiss because we're not living in a place where it's hot to start with and it's got hotter and now it's pretty much kind of unbearable or sort of a threat to life, And so, yeah, it is changing, and I think we need to recognise that those changes are important, even if they're not necessarily unpleasant, I guess.
Any other questions?
Thanks. So I'm curious, all 3 of your works in different ways kind of locate either retreat or safety or paradise kind of somewhere else, whether it's the family living in the city who retreats to the coastal house, or people who find paradise in these, distant places. And I'm wondering if any of you has a perspective to share on what that does to folks' relationship to the place that they actually live and spend most of your time. Kind of, Tiya, you're saying with the city, it's not seen as a place of nature because that's where people spend most of their time. So not only what does it do to our relationship to the paradise or the retreat, but to where we actually live.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that we often look toward other places as the spaces where we can escape our troubles. And an example of the book that I mentioned earlier in my comments about the enslaved women who ended up traveling north, they thought that going north was going to alleviate the incredible exploitation that they had suffered in the South. And it did help, but it didn't solve all the problems. They landed in the north right in the period of Jim Crow, incredible lynching, World War I, and so on. So we can't really escape our problems by going somewhere else, which I think means that we need to really think about where we are, what we can do where we are. And I'm going to say this in this room, I feel like it might be relevant. I think that if we occupy more than one space, like if we have a residence here and a residence there, that we could consider how those spaces could be useful and helpful to not just our own families, but to broader communities and other people who are going to be needing to move in the face of impermanence.
For me, I think a lot about how, a lot of the places we might travel to are places that are not as developed as where we come from, and don't have as many kind of advantages as where we come from. And we tend to romanticize those places and think of that as like the real good way to live. But when it comes down to it, the way we romanticize it is not something we would ever want for ourselves in a permanent way. It's even though we consider for that short time that we might go to a place that the local population there is living in a more pure, better way, we would like bemoan if that way of life that they have got kind of ruined by development. But the other way to look at that is that development is actually bringing their standard of living up to the one that we have back home. And so there's this very strange dichotomy of when we go to these places, kind of idealizing them, but wanting them idealized in a way that kind of keeps those local populations from advancing or from developing or from attaining the same kind of standard of living and the same advantages that we have back home.
I mean, I think I pretty much just agree with both of those things. I absolutely think that we look at other places and it's like looking at houses on Rightmove. It's like you think, if only I lived there, I'd just be better. But you'd still. The reality, obviously, is that you would still be you. I moved 5 years ago from London, which I hated, to the place that I am now, and I love it. I'm really happy, but I still look at other places and I'm like, oh, maybe that's better. It's like this profound human kind of thing. And I don't think that we can fix that, but it's probably good to talk about it.
Great. I think we have one more question over here.
Sure, I'll keep it short, but just a benchmark for people on Celsius versus Fahrenheit. I looked it up on Google. 30 degrees Celsius is about 86 Fahrenheit, so we have that here. But 40, if it was 40 in last summer in the UK, that's 104, so that's really getting up there. My question is, looking at sort of novels or literature that you've read on climate change or just environmental movements in general, I was wondering if you'd each have maybe a book that you'd recommend. I like Rachel Carson, Robert McFarlane, people like that, but it could be, again, philosophical or scientific, but just interested in that.
Great question. Thank you.
I couldn't hear the question very well, sorry.
The question was
Books you'd recommend.
environmental
Nothing to do with-
writing you'd recommend, climate writing.
One that is specifically in my realm, having to do with the topic of my book, is a book called Overbooked. The name of the author is escaping me right now, but it's a really thorough look at just how tourism has resulted in overdevelopment of so many places in so many ways. It's packed with just fascinating information. So,
I also cannot remember the author of this book because I am jet lagged and also I'm terrible with names. And also, I don't know if it's out in the US, but there is a book that's been published in the UK called Hope and Hell, A Decade to Solve the Climate Crisis. And that is a wonderful book. Like, it is a difficult read, but the arguments in it, I think, are compelling, and it does try and suggest ways that we can move forward, even if those are difficult. And I would recommend that if you can get hold of it.
I would recommend the work of Octavia E. Butler, a science fiction writer who has this great line about the convergence of the various problems we're facing today, which is big problems, not sexy. The book of hers that I'd recommend first is Parable of the Sower, which when she published this book was a near future oriented story, but it takes place in our present time, set in California and very much about climate change.
I'm going to second that. It is, and it's incredible to read a book that was written, a while ago that has got more and more relevant. It's a great, and it's also really enjoyable.
Great. Writers, yeah, I guess.
Your very last question, sorry, burning question. One is a comment, and that is that Frederick Law Olmsted built many beautiful parks in this country and abroad, and including Central Park. And his reason was that when people couldn't afford to have a second home, they could have leisure and community within those parks. And his 200th anniversary was last year, and the GCA, the Garden Club of America, celebrated it in a huge way. And that is one way that we can cut down on having second homes and burning electricity and heat. And that's a wonderful place to celebrate a second place to live. And the other thing is, I wondered what the three of you had to offer our audience as one takeaway of your best personal hope that we could do or pass down to our children, your personal hope, a takeaway that you would give us as something that we could do.
I can go. I have become more and more convinced that the single most important thing that we can do is pressure governments and other powerful bodies to enact change, because I don't think, I certainly don't think companies, involved in tourism and who have large carbon footprints are going to be self-motivated enough. And I also don't think individuals are probably self-motivated enough. I think the way to really make change happen is it has to be through government action. So that would be my single piece of advice, is to not only vote, but put pressures on in other ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that it's really important that while we don't absolve ourselves of individual responsibility, we don't get overwhelmed by how hard it is to fix this by ourselves, because actually it is a systemic problem. And so, yeah, we need that change. But also, we're all here in this room talking about this and thinking about it. And that, I think that is hope. I think that there is hope in doing that. So.
Yeah, I agree with both of these comments, and I will say something and then kind of cheat on the question. What I will say is that I think that we have to hang on to hope, and I think we do that in part by having a sense of purpose, by feeling that there is an aim and an intentionality about the time that we have here on this earth. And the second thing I will say is that I just think we have got to extend our circles of care. We cannot continue to feel like it's just me and my little nuclear family. We have to think about communities in a broader sense and about the different ways that people are being affected by these changes and how we can help beyond just the people that we know.
Great. Thank you all so much.